Imagine standing in a courtroom in the year 1692 and watching a grown man, a respected farmer and landowner, being pressed to death under heavy stones. Not hanged, not beheaded, pressed, slowly, over the course of 2 days. And the entire town watches, and nobody stops it. And the man, even as the stones crush the breath from his lungs, refuses to say a single word that would save his life. His name is Giles Corey. He is 80 years old, and the last words he ever speaks are, "More weight." 2 words, defiant to the last. That moment, that horrible, brutal, magnificent moment, tells you everything you need to know about what really happened in Salem in 1692. This was not a story about superstition alone. This was a story about power, about fear, about a community that had completely lost its mind and did not even know it. 20 people were executed in Salem during the witch trials of 1692. 1 man was pressed to death. 5 people died in prison. 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft. And the whole thing started with 2 little girls. 2 little girls who said they could not sleep, that something was pinching them, biting them, dragging them around the room. A doctor looked at them and had no medical explanation, and rather than say he did not know, he said something far worse. He said the devil was involved. That single diagnosis, delivered with all the authority of a learned man, opened a door that could not be closed again. What poured through that door was 300 years of fear, resentment, politics, theology, greed, and human cruelty dressed up as righteousness. But here is what the textbooks do not tell you. The Salem witch trials were not caused by ignorance. The people of Salem were not simple, uneducated peasants stumbling around in the dark. Many of them could read. Many of them had crossed an ocean in search of religious freedom. They had built communities, churches, farms, and governments from nothing. These were people of conviction and intelligence, and yet they condemned their neighbors to death on the testimony of children who claimed to see invisible spirits. How does that happen? How does an intelligent community arrive at that point? That is the real question. And the answer is so much more complex and so much more disturbing than you have ever been told. By the end of this story, you will not look at Salem the same way. You will not see it as a simple tale of ignorant Puritans afraid of the devil. You will see it as something that could happen anywhere, as something that has happened again and again throughout history, in different forms, with different names. You will see the political manipulation at work. You will understand the social dynamics that made accusation a survival strategy. You will hear the scientific theory that suggests a fungus on rye bread may have triggered the original hallucinations. And you will confront the most uncomfortable question of all. If you had been in Salem in 1692, which side would you have been on? Would you have spoken up? Or would you, like most people, have stayed quiet and hoped the madness passed you by? To understand Salem, you first have to understand the world that created it. And that world was cold, brutal, and absolutely terrified of God. The Puritans who settled New England in the early 1600s were not people who took religion lightly. They had left England because they believed the Church of England was corrupt, too Catholic, too compromised with worldly power. They wanted to build something pure, something holy, a city on a hill, as their leader John Winthrop famously called it, a community that would demonstrate to the entire world what a truly godly society looked like. That was the dream. That was the promise they made to God and to each other when they climbed aboard those ships and crossed the Atlantic into the unknown. The reality, of course, was something very different. New England in the 1600s was genuinely dangerous. Winters were brutal. Food was scarce. Diseases swept through settlements with horrifying regularity. Relations with the indigenous peoples of the region fluctuated between uneasy coexistence and outright warfare. King Philip's War, which ended in 1676, just 16 years before the witch trials began, had devastated New England. Entire towns had been burned to the ground. Hundreds of colonists had been killed. The psychological trauma of that war hung over the entire region like a storm cloud that never fully dispersed. People were anxious. People were exhausted. People were looking for explanations. And the Puritan theological framework provided those explanations in the most terrifying possible terms. The Puritans believed, genuinely and completely, that the devil was not a metaphor. He was a real being, an active force in the world, constantly seeking to corrupt and destroy God's chosen people. They believed that New England was specifically targeted by Satan precisely because it was trying to be holy. The more righteous your community, the more the devil would attack it. Smallpox? The devil. A bad harvest? The devil. A child who would not behave? Possibly the devil. This was not considered an extreme or paranoid position. This was simply the lens through which all of reality was understood. When something went wrong, and in 17th century New England things went wrong constantly, the question was not merely what happened, but what spiritual force was behind it. Into this charged, anxious, theologically superheated atmosphere, imagine now a very specific place and a very specific tension. Salem Village and Salem Town were not the same place. This is something almost everyone gets wrong. Salem Town was a thriving, prosperous port community on the Massachusetts coast. It had merchants, trade, connections to the wider Atlantic world, and a growing middle class with a secular, commercial orientation. Salem Village, which is now the town of Danvers, was several miles inland. It was a farming community, poorer, more insular, more religiously intense, and deeply suspicious of the wealthy, worldly people in Salem Town. The two communities had been quarreling for decades about taxes, church governance, and political representation. Salem Village wanted its independence. Salem Town kept refusing to grant it. That conflict, that smoldering resentment, had divided the village itself into two camps. And those two camps would become the engine of the witch trials. The two most important families in this internal conflict were the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnams were the dominant farming family in Salem Village. They were deeply invested in maintaining the village's religious and social identity. They wanted their own church, their own pastor, their own independence from Salem Town. The Porters were more prosperous, with commercial ties to Salem Town, and they consistently opposed the Putnam faction. For years, these two families had fought over everything: land boundaries, church decisions, political appointments. By 1692, the animosity between them was bone deep. And when the witch trials began, almost all of the accusers came from the Putnam side of the divide, and almost all of the accused were connected to the Porter side. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and patterns tell stories. Now let us introduce the man who, more than any other single individual, set the stage for what was about to happen. His name was Samuel Parris, and he was the minister of Salem Village. And he was deeply, profoundly unsuited to be a minister at all. Parris had not started out as a preacher. He had started out as a merchant in Barbados, failed at that, come back to Massachusetts, and then decided, somewhat inexplicably, that the ministry was his calling. He had attended Harvard College, but never graduated. He had negotiated his appointment to Salem Village with a level of financial aggression that shocked even his supporters. He demanded the deed to the minister's house, which was church property. He demanded the village pay for his firewood. He demanded a salary that was higher than his predecessors. He got most of what he asked for, but he made enemies in the process. Samuel Parris was a short, intense man with a face that contemporaries described as severe. He wore the plain, dark clothing of the Puritan minister, but there was nothing plain about his ambition or his anxieties. He had failed in business. He was deeply in debt. He was surrounded by a congregation that was divided about whether they even wanted him there. Half the village respected him. The other half, led by the Porter faction, refused to take communion from him. They would not even attend his church. Imagine preaching every week to a half-empty meeting house, knowing that your neighbors are deliberately staying home to insult you. Parris responded to this hostility by becoming increasingly extreme in his theology. His sermons grew darker, more accusatory. He told his congregation that the devil was among them. He was practically daring something to happen. In the Parris household lived three remarkable people who would become central to everything that followed. The first was his daughter Betty, who was 9 years old in 1692. She was a quiet, sensitive child, deeply affected by her father's intense religious atmosphere. The second was his niece, Abigail Williams, who was 11, and who was almost entirely unlike Betty. Abigail was sharp, bold, imaginative, and in possession of a quality that would prove very dangerous in the months ahead: the ability to read a room and tell people exactly what they wanted to hear. The third was Tituba, an enslaved woman whom Parris had brought with him from Barbados. Tituba occupied a unique and deeply vulnerable position in the household. She was a servant, an enslaved person, a foreigner, and a woman of color in a world that granted her no rights whatsoever. She would become the first person accused of witchcraft, and what she did with that accusation would change everything. The winter of 1691 to 1692 was unusually harsh, even by New England standards. Salem Village had been gripped for months by a cold that seemed to seep through every wall and into every bone. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams spent long, dark winter evenings in the kitchen with Tituba. According to later accounts, and historians have debated these accounts fiercely, the girls may have been engaging in forms of folk divination. Perhaps they were dropping egg whites into water and trying to read shapes in them, a common form of popular fortune-telling. Perhaps Tituba was telling them stories from her own cultural background, stories that were very different from the grim Calvinist theology they heard from Samuel Parris every Sunday. Whatever was happening in that kitchen during those long winter evenings, something shifted in Betty Parris. In January of 1692, Betty began to behave strangely. She would fall into fits, throwing herself on the floor, screaming, contorting her body. She complained that something was biting her and pinching her. She could not concentrate. She ran toward the fireplace as if she intended to throw herself into the flames. Her father was horrified. He prayed over her. He fasted. He brought in neighbors to pray with him. Nothing helped. Then Abigail Williams began to show the same symptoms. And then Ann Putnam, Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of Thomas Putnam, one of the most powerful men in the Putnam faction, also began having fits. The girls were examined by Dr. William Griggs, the village physician, a man who by all accounts was a conscientious and well-meaning practitioner of 17th century medicine. But 17th century medicine had very limited tools. Griggs could find no physical cause for the girls' symptoms, and so he made the diagnosis that would set everything in motion. The evil hand, he said, was upon them. The evil hand. In Puritan New England, that phrase carried the full weight of theological terror. The evil hand meant witchcraft. It meant that someone in the community was in league with the devil and was using that alliance to torment innocent children. The moment Griggs said those words, the entire character of the crisis changed. It was no longer a medical mystery. It was a spiritual emergency. And the Puritan response to spiritual emergencies was immediate, communal, and intense. Prayer meetings were held. Clergy from neighboring towns were consulted. The entire community focused its attention on the afflicted girls with an urgency and seriousness that would have been overwhelming even for a fully grown adult. The girls were no longer just sick children. They were witnesses to something cosmic. Their suffering was evidence of the devil's activity, and the community needed to know who was responsible. Put yourself in the position of these girls for a moment. They are between 9 and 12 years old. They are suddenly the center of attention in a world where children were normally seen and not heard. Every adult in the community is watching them. The minister, the most powerful man in the village, is asking them directly, "Who is hurting you?" The community needs an answer. The theology demands an answer. There must be a witch. Someone must be responsible. And the girls, whether they were suffering from a real physical or psychological condition, or whether they were consciously performing, or whether the truth lies somewhere in between, gave the community the answer it was demanding. They began to name names, and the names they chose were not random. They were chosen, whether consciously or not, with a precision that reveals the social geography of Salem Village with devastating clarity. The first 3 people they named were perfectly chosen, whether by instinct or by calculation or by genuine belief. They were Tituba, the enslaved woman who was the most vulnerable person imaginable and had no power whatsoever to defend herself. They were Sarah Good, a homeless, destitute woman who wandered through the village begging and muttering under her breath, someone the community already regarded with suspicion and contempt. And they were Sarah Osborne, an elderly, bedridden woman who had scandalized the village years earlier by living with a man before marrying him. 3 women who were already outsiders. 3 women who had already been marked by the community as somehow different, somehow troublesome, somehow not quite fitting the mold of the godly Puritan woman. The accusers could not have picked more perfect targets if they had sat down and planned it deliberately. And with these 3 names, the machinery of Salem's destruction clicked into motion. Sarah Good was brought in for examination first. She was a truly pitiable figure. Her husband was unable to support the family. They had no home. They wandered from house to house, relying on the charity of neighbors who were growing increasingly resentful. Good was known to mutter as she walked away from houses that refused her charity, and people in the village had already been whispering that her muttering was cursing. When she was examined by the magistrates, she was hostile and defiant. She denied everything. She accused Sarah Osborne instead. She was not a woman who had learned to bow and scrape and perform submission. She was angry, and her anger was read as evidence of guilt. The magistrates and the watching community saw her defiance not as the response of an innocent person wrongly accused, but as the obstinacy of someone who had made a pact with the devil. In a system already rigged, Sarah Good's refusal to play along made her fate inevitable. Sarah Osborne was a different kind of target. She was old and sick, barely able to walk. She denied everything clearly and consistently, but she had the misfortune of being connected to a land dispute with the Putnam family. Thomas Putnam had been involved in a legal conflict with Osborne's husband over property that had belonged to Osborne's first husband, a man named Robert Prince. The Putnams believed they had a right to property that Osborne's second husband controlled. This is not a coincidence. This is the pattern again. Land, money, resentment, accusation. Sarah Osborne would die in prison before ever coming to trial. She never had the chance to prove her innocence. The jail conditions of the period were lethal, and she simply could not survive them. She died in the cold, dark, disease-ridden Boston prison in May 1692, condemned by an accusation she never had the chance to properly contest. But it was Tituba who changed everything. Tituba who made the witch trials into something vast and unstoppable. Because Tituba did not deny the accusations, Tituba confessed. And her confession was extraordinary. She told the magistrates in elaborate detail about meetings with the devil. She described a tall man from Boston who had come to her and demanded she serve him. She described seeing cats, red and black, and a yellow bird, and a hairy creature she could not name. She described riding through the air on a stick with Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. She described a book with names in it, a long list of names, suggesting that there were many more witches in the community than just her and the two Sarahs. Her confession was vivid, dramatic, and absolutely terrifying. And the magistrates believed every word of it. Tituba had given them exactly what they needed. She had confirmed their worst fears. The devil was real. The witches were real. And there were more of them. Why did Tituba confess? Historians have been arguing about this for 3 centuries. Some believe she was tortured or threatened into it by Samuel Parris himself, who by this point desperately needed the trials to validate his authority and his theology. Some believe she understood, with the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived enslavement, exactly what the situation demanded. She could see what happened to people who denied the charges. They were held in prison under horrible conditions and eventually executed. But she could also see that the people who confessed were treated differently. The Puritans believed that a confessed witch who repented could be saved. So confessors were not immediately executed. They were kept alive to testify, to name more witches, to help purge the community of corruption. Tituba had no power, but she had information. Or at least she had the ability to produce information. And in that moment, information was the most valuable commodity in Salem. She used what she had. And she survived. Tituba was the only one of the 3 original accused who did not die as a result of the trials. Her confession did something that changed the entire trajectory of the crisis. Before she spoke, the witch trials were a local emergency, involving 3 specific, marginal individuals. After she spoke, they became something else entirely. They became a hunt. Because Tituba had said there were more witches. She had mentioned the book with names. She had implied that the corruption ran deep and wide through the community. Now, nobody was safe. Now anyone could be a witch. And in that atmosphere of universal suspicion, the accusations began to multiply with terrifying speed. Every person in Salem Village had to ask themselves the same terrifying question. Could my neighbor be a witch? And, even worse, could someone accuse me? More girls joined the afflicted circle. Elizabeth Hubbard, 17 years old, the niece of Dr. Griggs, began having fits. Mary Walcott, 17, from a prominent village family. Mercy Lewis, 19, who had survived a brutal Indian raid on her hometown of Falmouth and was described by contemporaries as dramatically intense, a young woman marked by genuine trauma who had lost her parents to violence and carried that weight in every word she spoke. Mary Warren, 20, a servant girl who would later withdraw her accusations only to renew them under pressure. And at the center of all of them the most influential, and the most relentless, was Ann Putnam, Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of Thomas and Ann Putnam. Ann Jr. would eventually accuse 62 people by name during the course of the trials. Her mother, Ann Sr., would accuse even more. The Putnam family was absolutely central to the witch hunt, and they had very specific reasons for wanting very specific people gone. The afflicted girls did not accuse randomly. The pattern of their accusations was not random. In the early weeks, they stuck to the kinds of people who fit the expected profile of a witch: poor women, marginal women, women who had already been socially marked as problematic. But then something shifted. On March 11, 1692, Ann Putnam Jr. accused Martha Corey, a church member in good standing, a respectable woman with no marginal status whatsoever. Martha Corey had made the mistake of expressing skepticism about the whole business. She had said publicly that she did not believe the girls were afflicted. She had laughed at the idea of witchcraft. And for that, she was named as a witch. The message was clear and chilling. Skepticism itself was dangerous. If you questioned the accusations, you might become an accused. If you defended the accused, you might become one of them. And so the community fell silent. The silence of the community is one of the most important and most overlooked aspects of the Salem witch trials. It is easy to look back 300 years and see the accusers as the villains and the accused as the victims, which they were. But the truly terrifying story is the story of the people who did nothing. The neighbors who saw what was happening and understood it was wrong, but said nothing. The friends who privately believed in the innocence of the accused, but publicly did nothing to help them. The community leaders who had the authority and the standing to challenge the proceedings, but chose instead to stay quiet and stay safe. This silence, this collective failure of moral courage, was what allowed 20 people to die. The accusers needed willing enablers, and Salem was full of them. Every person who said nothing was casting a vote for the executions. The court that would ultimately execute those 20 people was established in May of 1692 by the new governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips. Phips was a fascinating and deeply contradictory figure. Born in poverty in frontier Maine, he had made himself wealthy through a combination of genuine courage, political cunning, and a famous salvage operation in which he recovered a Spanish treasure ship and used the profits to buy his way into respectability. He had just arrived in Massachusetts with a new royal charter that was supposed to resolve the colony's political instability, and he was immediately confronted with a jail full of accused witches and a panicking community. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He appointed a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear the witchcraft cases, and he put in charge of it his lieutenant governor, William Stoughton. William Stoughton was everything Samuel Parris wanted to be and never quite managed. He was genuinely educated, genuinely powerful, genuinely connected to the highest levels of Massachusetts society. He had attended Harvard and then Oxford. He had served as a colonial agent in London. He was, by any measure of the period, a sophisticated and intelligent man. And he was also completely, utterly convinced that the devil was at work in Salem, and that it was his personal mission from God to destroy that work. Stoughton was a tall, spare man with a deeply lined face and cold, precise eyes that his contemporaries found intimidating, even in moments of ordinary conversation. He carried himself with the certainty of someone who had never seriously doubted his own judgment. He presided over the court of Oyer and Terminer with the absolute conviction of someone who believes that every decision he makes is right, because God has put him in that chair to make it. He was the most dangerous kind of judge imaginable. The court that Stoughton led operated according to rules that, even by the standards of 17th-century jurisprudence, were deeply problematic. The most controversial was the admission of spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony about what someone saw in the spirit world. If a witness said that the specter, the spirit, of a particular person had come to them in a dream or a vision and tortured them, that testimony was admitted as evidence against that person in court. The logic behind this was theologically coherent by Puritan standards. The devil could only use the shape of a person who had consented to serve him. Therefore, if your specter was appearing to torment innocent people, you must have given the devil permission to use your image. Therefore, you were a witch. The accused could not win. Their innocence was not a defense. The very fact that their specter had appeared was treated as proof of guilt, and no argument could counter it. Some Puritan ministers objected to the use of spectral evidence even at the time. The most important objection came from Increase Mather, the most prominent clergyman in Massachusetts, whose son, Cotton Mather, was one of the most vocal supporters of the trials. Increase Mather was a heavy-set, formidably intelligent man in his early 50s, a Harvard president, the author of dozens of theological works, and a person whose opinion carried enormous weight throughout the colony. He argued that the devil might, in fact, be able to assume the shape of an innocent person without that person's consent. If that was true, then spectral evidence was worthless as proof of anything. But his objections were not enough to stop the court, at least not immediately. Stoughton dismissed the concerns and continued pressing forward. The trials accelerated, and the executions began. The first person hanged was Bridget Bishop on June 10, 1692. Bridget Bishop was 58 years old, a tavern keeper, a widow, and a woman who had been accused of witchcraft once before, a decade earlier, and had been cleared. She was vivid, outspoken, and wore a red bodice with lace trim in a community where ostentatious clothing was considered a sign of moral weakness. She had been married 3 times. She had arguments with her neighbors. She ran a tavern that served alcohol and hosted games of shuffleboard, activities that the more rigid Puritans in the community found offensive. She did not conform to the expected model of the quiet, submissive, godly woman. She denied everything at her trial. She looked the judges in the eye and told them she was innocent. The court found her guilty in less than an hour. They hanged her on Gallows Hill, a rocky outcrop just outside the town, and her body was left hanging in the summer heat. After Bridget Bishop, the executions came in waves. On July 19th, 5 women were hanged on the same day: Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds. 5 women, 1 morning. Of all the people executed in Salem, Rebecca Nurse stands out as the most devastating, the most impossible, the most revealing of what the witch trials had become. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old. She was a grandmother many times over. She was a deeply devout woman, beloved by her community, whose piety was so evident and so genuine that she was considered one of the most truly Christian people in Salem Village. She was tall and slender, aged by decades of childbearing and farm labor, but with a dignity in her bearing that everyone who knew her remarked upon. When her name was first accused, the community was stunned. Even many of the accuser's supporters found this one difficult to believe. When Rebecca Nurse was tried, the jury initially acquitted her. They looked at the evidence and found it insufficient. They looked at this frail, elderly woman and could not bring themselves to condemn her. The courtroom erupted. The afflicted girls went into their most dramatic fits yet. They screamed, they writhed, they pointed at Nurse and howled that her specter was attacking them, right there in the courtroom. Judge Stoughton sent the jury back to reconsider. He drew their attention to a remark Rebecca Nurse had made, a mumbled, ambiguous statement that he suggested proved her guilt. The jury came back with a guilty verdict. Governor Phipps actually issued a reprieve for Nurse, one of the very few times during the entire crisis that he intervened on behalf of the accused. And then, pressure was applied. Stoughton threatened. The community demanded. And Phipps reversed the reprieve. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on July 19th alongside 4 other women, her prayers still on her lips. The hanging of Rebecca Nurse tells you everything about the mechanics of mass hysteria. At some level, some of the people running the trials must have known something was wrong. A jury acquits, a governor reprieved, a beloved grandmother is nevertheless executed. The system that was supposed to protect the innocent had been completely captured by the hysteria. Everyone who should have been a check on the process had instead become part of the process. And once you have let that happen, once you have made the choice to go along rather than stand up, each subsequent step becomes easier. Each subsequent execution becomes less shocking. You become accustomed to it. And that accustomization, that gradual normalization of horror, is one of the most important and most terrifying lessons of Salem. It is not that the people of Salem suddenly became monsters. It is that they became accustomed. And accustomization is how ordinary people enable atrocities. The August and September executions continued with grinding regularity. John Proctor, the first man to be condemned, was a farmer and tavern keeper who had initially been skeptical of the whole business. He had said publicly that the afflicted girls should be whipped for their nonsense, and he had been accused himself after his servant Mary Warren, who had briefly withdrawn from the afflicted circle, rejoined it after being threatened with accusation herself. Proctor was a large, vigorous man in his late 50s, known throughout the community for his directness and his impatience with what he considered foolishness. From prison, he wrote a remarkable letter to the clergy of Boston, arguing with extraordinary lucidity that the trials were unjust, that confessions had been extracted under torture, that no one in Salem could receive a fair hearing. The clergy sent a carefully worded reply that expressed concern but offered no concrete help. Proctor hanged on August 19th. On that same day, George Burroughs was brought to the gallows. Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village who had left under difficult circumstances years earlier, and who had been brought back from Maine in chains on the accusation of being the ringleader of the entire witch conspiracy, the grand wizard of Satan's operations in New England. He was a small, physically powerful man, a former Yale graduate, soft-spoken and precise in his speech, who had lived with the shadow of Salem's suspicions following him for years before the crisis gave his enemies the weapon they needed. As he stood on the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, which, according to Puritan belief, was something a witch could not do. The crowd wavered. People started to murmur, and Cotton Mather, who was there on horseback, rode forward and told the crowd that Burroughs had been a minister in the service of the devil, and that the devil could help him say the prayer. Burroughs hanged. The crowd dispersed, and Cotton Mather rode away. Cotton Mather deserves a moment of his own in this story, because he is one of the most complex and troubling figures of the entire affair. He was 29 years old in 1692. He was already one of the most prolific and celebrated writers in New England. He would go on to produce more than 450 published works in his lifetime, a staggering output by any standard. He was genuinely brilliant, genuinely learned, and genuinely terrified of the devil. He believed with every fiber of his being that Satan was making a direct assault on New England, and he believed it was his personal responsibility to help defeat that assault. He attended executions. He wrote supportive accounts of the trials. He published a book called Wonders of the Invisible World that celebrated the court's work, and he would spend the rest of his long life defending his role, even as the world around him changed and the consensus shifted toward seeing the trials as a catastrophic injustice. Martha Corey, who had been among the first respectable people accused, was hanged on September 22nd, along with 7 others, in the largest mass execution of the entire crisis. Her husband, old Giles Corey, had been accused alongside her. Giles Corey was 80 years old, a tough, cantankerous farmer who had had his own legal troubles in earlier years, including a conviction for beating a servant to death, a fact that some of his neighbors may have been thinking about as they watched the trials unfold. He had actually been slow to defend his wife at the beginning, and there are historians who believe he may have initially half-believed the accusations against her. But by the time he himself was accused, he had seen enough. He saw what the court was doing. He saw that the court's procedures made conviction essentially inevitable, and Giles Corey decided to fight back in the only way available to him. Under English law, a prisoner who refused to enter a plea could not be tried. Without a trial, there could be no conviction. Without a conviction, there could be no execution. And without an execution, his property could not be seized by the court and taken from his heirs. Giles Corey stood mute. He refused to say guilty or not guilty. He refused to enter any plea at all. The court responded with a punishment called peine forte et dure, the pressing. The prisoner was laid on his back in an open field. A board was placed on his chest. Stones were piled on the board, one by one, slowly, with the deliberate patience of people who believed they were doing God's work. The intent was to coerce a plea. Giles Corey said nothing. More stones were added. His tongue protruded from his mouth. The sheriff used his cane to push it back in. More stones. Giles Corey's last words, repeated as the stones crushed the life from him over 2 long days, were, "More weight." He was pressed to death. His property passed to his heirs as he had intended. He won. The story of Giles Corey is the story of Salem in miniature. It is the story of what happens when an individual decides that there is something more important than survival. Corey could have entered a plea. He could have confessed, as so many others did. He could have found a way to survive. He chose not to. He chose instead to use his death as an act of resistance, to deny the court what it wanted even as it killed him. That kind of defiance does not come from nowhere. It comes from a person who has looked at the situation clearly and decided that there are some prices too high to pay, even for life. Giles Corey was not a saint. He was a grumpy, difficult, argumentative old man who had spent his life in minor legal quarrels with his neighbors. But in the end, he was magnificent. And those 2 words, more weight, ring across 330 years as clearly as a bell. Now let us step back from the individual stories for a moment and look at the larger picture. Because the pattern of the accusations in Salem is extraordinarily revealing. Who was accused? Look at the list. A disproportionate number of the accused were women, particularly women who were in some way economically independent, women who had inherited property, women who had no male guardian to speak for them. Rebecca Nurse and her 2 sisters, Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce, all accused, came from a family that had long been involved in property disputes with the Putnam faction. John Proctor had land that his neighbors coveted. George Burroughs had left Salem Village under circumstances that left a lot of hard feelings behind him. The accused were not randomly selected. They were people who, for various reasons, had enemies. They were people whose removal from the community would benefit specific other people. This is not speculation. This is documented history. Thomas Putnam, The patriarch of the most active accusing family wrote the formal complaints that initiated many of the prosecutions. Thomas Putnam was a large, deliberate man in his mid-40s, a man who had spent years watching influence and property he considered rightfully his slip away from him. His father had disinherited him in favor of a half-brother. His family's political standing in the village had been declining for years. The witch trials were, for Thomas Putnam, an opportunity to reverse all of those losses simultaneously. His daughter Anne and his wife Anne were among the most prolific accusers. His servant, Mercy Lewis, was one of the core afflicted girls. The Putnam family's involvement in the witch trials is so systematic, so consistent, and so perfectly aligned with their own interests that it is almost impossible to view it as coincidental. But cynical manipulation alone does not explain the full scope of what happened. The truth is darker and more complex than that. Because not everyone who participated in the witch trials was a cynical manipulator. The vast majority were simply frightened people, reacting to a frightening situation according to the tools their culture had given them. The mothers and fathers who brought their children to testify believed, or at least half believed, that their children were genuinely suffering at the hands of supernatural forces. The neighbors who testified against the accused were not all liars. Some of them genuinely believed what they said. The entire community was operating within a theological and cultural framework that made the existence of witches not just possible, but expected. When you live in a world where the devil is real and active, and specifically targeting your community, the question is not whether witches exist. The question is where they are. And the accusers provided that answer with the moral authority of suffering witnesses. They were young, they were in pain, and they were pointing their fingers. What kind of monster disbelieves a suffering child? This brings us to one of the most fascinating and controversial theories about the Salem witch trials. A theory that, if true, may explain a great deal about why the crisis started when it did and where it did. In 1976, a graduate student in psychology named Linda Caporael published a paper in the journal Science that proposed a radical explanation for the original symptoms of the afflicted girls. Caporael suggested that the girls were suffering from convulsive ergotism, a condition caused by eating bread contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain in specific weather conditions. Ergot produces alkaloids that are chemically related to lysergic acid diethylamide, the compound known as LSD. In sufficient doses, these compounds cause hallucinations, convulsions, sensations of crawling skin and biting, and intense psychological disturbance. In other words, almost all of the symptoms that Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and the other afflicted girls displayed. The evidence for the ergot theory is circumstantial, but genuinely compelling. The village of Salem had the right kind of rye crops and the right kind of climate conditions in the wet summer of 1691 to produce ergot contamination. The symptoms described by the afflicted girls match clinical descriptions of ergotism with uncomfortable precision. The afflictions were concentrated in the western part of Salem village, near the Putnam family's farms, and the boundary of the affliction roughly corresponds to what you would expect if the contaminated grain came from a specific part of the local supply. When the crisis ended in the fall of 1692, the timing coincides with the end of the growing season, when contaminated grain from the previous year would have been exhausted. These are not proofs, but they are not nothing, and they raise a question that ought to make everyone uncomfortable. What if the whole thing started with bad bread? Other researchers have proposed other physical explanations. Some have suggested that the girls may have been suffering from encephalitis lethargica, a form of sleeping sickness that produces neurological symptoms strikingly similar to those described in the court records. Others have pointed to Lyme disease, which was certainly present in New England at the time and can cause joint pain, neurological symptoms, and behavioral changes. Still others have proposed that the symptoms were entirely psychological, a form of what we would today call mass psychogenic illness, the clinical term for what used to be called mass hysteria. Mass psychogenic illness is a real, well-documented phenomenon. It tends to strike communities under extreme social stress. It spreads through observation, through suggestion, through the social reinforcement of symptoms. If you are part of a community where witchcraft is real, and where affliction by a witch is a plausible explanation for your symptoms, and you watch your closest friends display those symptoms and receive enormous attention and sympathy in response, the unconscious mind can produce those symptoms in a person who is genuinely suffering. The truth is probably not a single theory. The truth is probably all of these things at once. Perhaps some of the original girls genuinely had physical symptoms that could have been caused by ergot or another environmental factor. Perhaps those symptoms then spread through mass psychogenic illness to other girls in the community. Perhaps some of the later accusers were consciously performing, using the established framework of affliction and witchcraft as a tool to address their own social and economic grievances. And perhaps the entire system was then exploited and amplified by specific political actors, the Putnams and their allies, who saw an opportunity and seized it. History is rarely caused by a single thing. History is usually caused by a confluence of a dozen things, each of which would not have been sufficient on its own, but which together created a perfect storm. Salem was a perfect storm, and it required almost everything to go wrong simultaneously for it to happen. The perfect storm of 1692 finally began to exhaust itself in the fall of that year, for a combination of reasons that are themselves revealing. The first cracks appeared when the accusers went too far. They began accusing people who were too prominent, too well-connected, too obviously respectable for the accusations to be credible, even within the community's own framework. They accused the wife of Governor Phipps himself. They accused family members of Increase Mather, the most respected minister in Massachusetts. They accused Captain John Alden, the son of the famous John and Priscilla Alden, a war hero and prominent Boston merchant who was known throughout New England. These people had resources. They had connections. They had the ability to flee, which Alden did, escaping from prison and hiding out in New York until the trials ended. And their accusations forced powerful people who had previously stayed quiet to start asking very uncomfortable questions about the entire proceedings. At the same time, Increase Mather finally published his collected work on the subject, a book called Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits Personating Men. In it, he argued systematically and forcefully that spectral evidence was not sufficient basis for conviction. He repeated his argument that the devil might be able to use the shape of an innocent person. His conclusion was blunt. He wrote that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person should be condemned. This was a remarkable statement for the time. It was essentially an argument for what we would today recognize as a foundational principle of criminal justice, the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof on the prosecution. Coming from the most respected religious authority in Massachusetts, it carried enormous weight. And it gave other doubters permission to voice the questions they had been afraid to ask. Governor Phipps, who had been largely absent during the worst of the trials, dealing with military matters on the frontier, finally began to pay serious attention. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. He replaced it with a new superior court that specifically excluded spectral evidence from consideration. And when the new court began hearing cases in January 1693, the results were dramatically different. Out of 52 accused persons brought to trial, the new court convicted only 3. Phipps reprieved all of them. He then issued a general pardon for all remaining accused persons still in prison. The trials were over. But the dying was not done. At least 5 people died in prison after the court was dissolved, unable to pay the jail fees that were required before they could be released, dying in cold, dark, disease-ridden cells for crimes that the colony would eventually acknowledge they had never committed. The system that had condemned them also trapped them in its aftermath. The reckoning came slowly. In January 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and reflection, acknowledging that errors had been made in the witch trials. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges of the court of Oyer and Terminer, stood in the South Church in Boston while his pastor read aloud a statement in which Sewall took personal blame and shame for the conduct of the trials, asking for God's forgiveness and the forgiveness of the community. Sewall was a prosperous Boston merchant and magistrate, a careful and methodical man who spent years after the trials in private prayer and public good works trying to make amends for what he had done. His apology was an extraordinary public act of contrition, almost unparalleled in the political culture of the time. Most of his fellow judges never expressed any regret at all. William Stoughton, who had presided over the executions, went on to serve as acting governor of Massachusetts and died honored and respected, never uttering a single word of apology for anything he had done. Samuel Parris was eventually forced out of his position in Salem Village in 1696, driven away by the resentment of his congregation, many of whom blamed him directly for the crisis. He spent the rest of his life moving from position to position, never finding the stability he sought, dying in relative obscurity in 1720. Tituba was sold by Paris to pay his jail fees and debts, her fate after that unknown, lost entirely to history. She disappears from the record without a trace. The enslaved woman who had started the entire cascade of accusations, who had confessed to riding through the air with the devil and given the community the monster story it needed, vanishes from the historical record before anyone thought to write down what became of her. That absence is itself a kind of statement about who counted in 17th century Massachusetts. The afflicted girls scattered. Most of them lived out their lives in obscurity. A few of them married and had children and grew old in the same communities where they had accused their neighbors of witchcraft. Their victims' families had to live alongside them. They had to see them at the market, at church, on the road. What those encounters felt like, what was said and not said, what was remembered and not remembered, we will never fully know. Only one of the major accusers ever offered a formal, public apology for what she had done, and she was the youngest of them and the most prolific, and in some ways the most complicit. And she was 12 years old when she did it. And none of that makes her apology simple. Ann Putnam Jr. was 12 years old when she accused 62 people. She was the most powerful, the most prolific, and arguably the most complicit of all the accusers. And she was 12 years old. Whatever she was doing in 1692, whatever combination of genuine belief, social pressure, family influence, and personal agency drove her accusations, she was still a child. And children are not born cynical. They are made cynical by the adults around them. Ann Putnam grew up surrounded by adults who were deeply invested in the witch hunt, who praised her for her accusations, who validated her authority, who used her testimony as a weapon in a dispute that was entirely adult in its origins. She grew up in a world where what she was doing was not only acceptable, but heroic. And then that world changed, and she had to live with what she had done. In 1706, when Ann Putnam was 26 years old and seeking to become a full member of the Salem Village Church, she read aloud before the congregation a statement of apology. She called what had happened a great delusion of Satan. She said she did not accuse anyone out of anger, malice, or ill will, and she begged forgiveness of all those she had wronged. She asked particularly to be forgiven by the families of those who had been executed. She was 26 years old. She had lived for 14 years with the knowledge of what she had participated in. How do we understand that apology? Is it sincere? Is it self-serving? Is it too little, too late? It is probably all of those things at once. But it was an apology. It was more than most of the people who ran the trials ever offered. And in a story full of failures of character, a 26-year-old woman standing before a community and saying she was wrong matters. The legacy of the Salem witch trials is not simple. It is not just a story of a terrible mistake corrected. The story of Salem echoes through American history in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. The witch trial dynamic, the accusation without evidence, the social pressure to conform or be accused, the impossibility of proving innocence once the accusation has been made, the destruction of individuals by institutional processes that have been captured by a single, powerful narrative, appears again and again throughout history. In the 1950s, during the McCarthy era, Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee used precisely the Salem playbook against suspected communists. The procedure was identical. You were accused. You could prove your innocence by naming others. If you refused to cooperate, your silence was treated as guilt. If you named others, you might survive, but the people you named would face the same process. Arthur Miller, who wrote the great play The Crucible about Salem, wrote it explicitly as a commentary on McCarthyism. He understood that Salem was not an aberration. He understood that Salem was a template. The political manipulation visible in Salem, the way the Putnam faction weaponized the hysteria to destroy their enemies, the way personal grievances were dressed up in the language of community protection, the way the accusation became a tool for advancing specific interests while claiming to serve the common good. This dynamic does not belong to the 17th century. It is a human pattern. It repeats whenever communities are under severe stress, whenever institutional protections are weakened, whenever the rule of evidence and the presumption of innocence are suspended in the name of emergency. What makes Salem so important as a historical case study is precisely that it is so well documented. We can trace the accusations back to their origins. We can identify the political actors and their motives. We can follow the money and the land and the resentments. We can see exactly how it worked. And seeing exactly how it worked is the first step toward recognizing it when it happens again. The ergot theory, the mass hysteria theory, the political manipulation theory. None of them individually explain Salem completely, but together they reveal something profound about the nature of the event. Salem was a community that was genuinely stressed. The people who suffered the original symptoms may have been genuinely ill, whether from ergot or from psychosomatic illness, or from both. The illness spread through social contagion in a community that had the theological framework to interpret it as supernatural attack. Political actors then seized the crisis and directed it toward specific targets that served their interests. Institutional actors, the courts, the clergy, the government, failed to apply the checks on power that should have protected the innocent. And a community that knew, at some level, that something had gone wrong, chose silence and complicity over the harder path of speaking up. Every single one of those failures was necessary. Remove any one of them, and the tragedy does not happen in the same way. Every single one of those dynamics is recognizable today. Every single one of those dynamics is present in the world around us in different forms. The specific targets change. The accusations change. The language changes. But the underlying social and psychological mechanics, the way fear creates unanimity, the way accusation becomes safer than defense, the way institutions can be captured by a single, powerful narrative and lose the ability to question it. These things do not change because they are not products of any particular culture or era. They are products of human nature interacting with social pressure and institutional weakness. Salem did not happen because the Puritans were uniquely credulous or uniquely cruel.
Salem happened because human beings, under sufficient pressure, with sufficient institutional failure and sufficient political manipulation, are capable of putting their neighbors to death and calling it justice. The 20 people who died at Salem had names. They had families. They had hopes and fears and ordinary human lives that were cut short by the intersection of bad luck, bad theology, bad politics, and the worst of human nature. Bridget Bishop, who wore her red bodice and refused to bow down. Rebecca Nurse, who prayed her way to the gallows with her faith still intact, who was so devout that her jury initially could not bring themselves to condemn her. John Proctor, who wrote brilliant, clear-eyed letters from prison that could have been written by a man living in a century of reason, rather than a man about to die on a charge of witchcraft. Giles Corey, who chose his own way to die rather than give the court the satisfaction of a trial. Mary Easty, who from prison wrote not a plea for herself, but a petition asking the court to be more careful in future cases so that no more innocent people would die. Mary Easty knew she was going to die. She used her final days to try to prevent the same fate from befalling others. She was hanged on September 22nd, 1692. We owe these people more than we have given them. We owe them the serious, unflinching examination of what happened to them and why. We owe them the acknowledgement that they were not abstractions, not symbols, not cautionary tales, but human beings who suffered a specific injustice at specific hands in a specific place and time. We owe them the honesty to admit that the conditions that created their deaths were not unique to their time, were not the product of a particular religious system that we have now left behind, were not the result of ignorance that we have now transcended. We owe them the recognition that the same potential for the same kind of injustice lives in every human community, including our own. And we owe them the determination to build and maintain the institutions and the habits of mind that can resist it. The witch trials formally ended in 1693. The legal rehabilitation took much longer. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature finally passed a bill restoring the good names of many of those convicted and awarding a total of £578 and 12 shillings in compensation to the heirs of the executed. It was a pitifully small amount. It left out many of the victims entirely, and it came nearly 20 years too late to mean anything to the people who had suffered. The last formal legal exoneration of the Salem victims did not come until 1957, when the state of Massachusetts passed a resolution formally exonerating them. And the final victim, Anne Pudiator, was not specifically named in an exoneration until 2001, more than 300 years after her death. 300 years for justice to arrive at a final accounting. That is the pace of institutional reckoning. That is how long it takes for a community to fully face what it has done. Salem Village was eventually renamed Danvers in 1752, a change that spoke for itself. The people there wanted to distance themselves from the name that had become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in American history. Salem Town, the larger commercial center, kept its name. Today it has turned its terrible history into a tourism industry, complete with witch museums, witch shops, and an annual Haunted Happenings festival every October that brings hundreds of thousands of visitors to the city. There is something genuinely strange about this, something that captures the ambivalence of the American relationship to Salem. We are fascinated by it. We dress up as witches for Halloween. We turn it into entertainment and commerce. And in the process, we sometimes forget that real people died, that real families were destroyed,
that real injustice happened on those streets, at that hill, in that courtroom, in those prisons. The entertainment and the memory coexist uneasily, and that tension is itself worth something, if we are willing to sit with it honestly. But Salem is genuinely useful to us if we are willing to engage with it honestly rather than just consume it as entertainment. Salem gives us a vocabulary for something that is otherwise very hard to talk about clearly. The phrase witch hunt has entered the language as a metaphor for any accusation-driven process that abandons the presumption of innocence. The very existence of that phrase, the fact that we needed a word for that kind of thing, tells you something about how common the pattern is. When we call something a witch hunt, we are invoking Salem. We are saying, this process has abandoned the standards of evidence and justice that protect the innocent. We are drawing on 300 years of historical memory to make a point about the present. That is what history is supposed to do. Not just preserve the past, but provide frameworks for understanding the world we actually live in. The story of Salem is also, ultimately, a story about the failure of community. Communities are supposed to protect their members. The social contract, the fabric of mutual obligation and trust that holds a community together, is supposed to ensure that no individual is left defenseless against the power of the state or the accusations of the crowd. In Salem, that contract was catastrophically broken. Neighbors testified against neighbors. Friends abandoned friends. Families were torn apart. People who had prayed together, worked together, mourned together, turned on each other with a ferocity that should have been impossible in a group of people who had shared years of common struggle and common faith. And yet it happened. Because fear is stronger than community loyalty. Or rather, fear can be made stronger than community loyalty by the right combination of pressure and manipulation and institutional failure. Understanding that vulnerability is not pleasant, but it is necessary. And so we come at last to the question that has been lurking beneath the surface of this entire story. Not why specific individuals made specific decisions, not why the Putnams manipulated the hysteria, or why Stoughton refused to hear the evidence of innocence, or why the community fell silent. Those questions have answers. The deeper question is, why, at the most fundamental level, communities like Salem are capable of what Salem did? And I think the answer is this. Certainty is dangerous. The certainty of Stoughton, who never doubted for a moment that he was doing God's work. The certainty of the accusers, who never wavered from their testimony. The certainty of the community, which found it easier to believe in witch conspiracies than to question the process that was producing the evidence for them. Certainty that cannot be questioned is how ordinary people authorize extraordinary cruelty. When Judge Samuel Sewall stood in that church in January 1697 and accepted blame for the deaths of people he had condemned, he was doing something that is remarkably rare in human history. He was a person in power admitting, publicly and formally, that he had been wrong, that what he had done in the name of justice was in fact injustice, that the certainty with which he had acted was not the certainty of truth, but the certainty of a closed mind operating within a broken system. His apology could not restore the dead, but it pointed towards something important. The possibility that human beings can look at their own mistakes clearly enough to acknowledge them, and to begin, however slowly and imperfectly, to build something better in their place. That possibility, that capacity for acknowledgement and change, is the only genuinely hopeful thing the story of Salem offers us. So here you are, at the end of this story. You came in thinking you knew Salem. Perhaps you knew the basics, the witch trials, the Puritans, the hysteria. And maybe you knew a bit more. Maybe you knew about the political tensions, the land disputes, the social hierarchies. But now you have seen the whole picture. The ergo in the rye that may have set the original symptoms in motion, the psychogenic spread of illness through a community primed by theology and stress to interpret suffering as supernatural attack. The Putnam family's calculated exploitation of a community in crisis. The courts that abandoned evidence and made conviction inevitable. The ministers who both supported and challenged the process. The accusers who were children. The accused who were human beings. The community that chose silence. And the few extraordinary individuals who chose otherwise. You know about Giles Corey and those 2 words. You know about Rebecca Nurse and the jury that tried to save her. You know about Tituba, who understood the system well enough to survive it. You know about Ann Putnam's apology, 14 years too late, for things she had done at 12 years old. And you know, now, the question that matters most. Not what happened in Salem in 1692. You know what happened. The question is, what happens in any community under sufficient stress, with sufficient institutional failure and sufficient political manipulation? What happens when the mechanisms that protect the innocent are removed? What happens when fear becomes the primary basis for public decision-making? What happens when the social pressure to conform becomes so intense that speaking the truth feels more dangerous than watching an innocent person die? Salem is not history, locked safely away in the past. Salem is a warning, written in the blood of 20 people who did nothing wrong except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemies. It is the most American of warnings, and the most human. 300 years from now, when scholars look back at our time, what will they see? Which of our certainties, our righteous prosecutions, our community panics, our institutional failures, will look to them the way Salem looks to us? What are we getting wrong right now, in ways we cannot fully see because we are too close to it, too embedded in it, too frightened to question it? I genuinely do not know the answer, but I think asking the question honestly, without assuming we are exempt from the same human weaknesses that destroyed Salem, is the beginning of something important. Because the people of Salem were not different from us. They were us, in different clothing, under different pressures, with different labels on the same fears. And if we cannot see that clearly, then the lesson of Gallows Hill has not yet been learned. If this story made you think, if it shifted something in the way you understand history, human nature, or the world you live in right now, then please hit that subscribe button and join the community at Cradle of Democracy. This is what we do here. We take the stories that history has left us, and we dig into them until we find the truth that has been buried under centuries of myth, legend, and comfortable simplification. We ask the questions that are supposed to be too hard to ask. We follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that makes us uneasy. Because history is not a collection of reassuring tales about how things used to be worse. History is a mirror. And sometimes what it shows us is very hard to look at. But looking at it is the only way to see clearly where we are and where we need to go. Subscribe to Cradle of Democracy, and when you are done here, go watch our video on the McCarthy-era hearings. Because I promise you, once you have heard the full story of Salem, what you see in those Senate chambers will look very, very familiar. See you there.